Pod. Pod.
Right, evening. This is a bit mad for me, so it's usually in my bedroom, so it's quite a difference. But yeah, cheers for turning out. Obviously the guests, to Jacob if he's here for doing the artwork. Sounds like he's not. Anyway, let's crack on with it. Here's Jamie and Conor, yeah. Right, Jamie, you bought some props. Thought we could get us going.
Yeah, I went to a record shop today and I had a look through their CD collection and I found some things that I thought would be completely relevant for having a chat today, and I've gifted them to Conor. One of them's got your name on it. There's a NME CD from 2001, which what's it called? When He's Singing. I guess we'll get into it later because I think these are relevant to the questions, basically. I was going to sort of bring it up. There's also Hanging with the Strokes, Julian Casablancas tunes chosen by Julian.
Any bangers on there?
Yeah, there's loads of bangers on here, like 70s bangers on here, and then there's some contemporary bangers on here, which I think we'll get into later on as well. It's NME's Essential Noise, Jet, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club.
But the point of this, though, as you were saying, right, this is 2001.
This is where it changes, yeah.
Yeah, 2001, and on here are Primal Scream, Badly Drawn Boy, U2, Fatboy Slim, Radiohead, Oasis, Star Sailor. It's like nothing has changed.
It's a 90s hangover that's still going in 2000.
You know, there's Out the Drive-In and there's JJ72, and yeah, and that's kind of it.
That's it.
That's it.
There was a hangover from the 90s, and there was nothing. There was not champion. Things hadn't changed at this point in time, and this is September 2001. So I thought it was super interesting because, you know, the Strokes had put out their first single, and it's like, wow, the NME and culture was about to change here, and move on. So I thought this was really relevant and really nice. I thought it's a nice gift.
Totally. But I'm really glad you brought these along, because this one, Hanging with the Strokes, because I look at it and I go, I remember signing off this artwork. I remember that, you know, that line, Hanging with the Strokes, it's really relevant because I wrote that because that was what I thought. If you were a reader of the NME, the one thing that everybody wanted to do was hang with the Strokes.
I know I did.
Yeah, totally. It was like you know, they were the party guys, and that's why it was named the way it was, because this was as close as you could get to actually being inside their head. And it was the first time that we got to kind of fill it with a whole load of,
it's a very good compilation.
It's a really good compilation. So most of it is stuff that they chose. So the way it would work is they give us a massive long list and we go off and see what we could sign. But yeah, that stuff that you just mentioned at the end, Jet, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, Franz Ferdinand, Cooper Temple, Claus and the Coral. It's like you can just feel the beginning of the scene.
Yeah, it's just
together.
Started to happen. Or you like the NME made sure they squeezed on a few other things that were happening at the time, and I thought it's relevant till we get on because I know what we were going to talk about. But you called it NME's Essential Noise, you know, and that's to be parked for later on. Yeah. And I also found this compilation called Cigarettes and Alcohol. I really apologise, but it's from your competitors, Mojo magazine, from 2007. A good year if anyone was there, and it's loads of drinks, loads of songs about cigarettes and alcohol, which we'll get into later.
Yes. What were they like? I mean, you said you didn't really deal with bands much, but did you deal with the Strokes in that instance, or not really?
I was thinking about this today. I tended to keep my distance most of the time. Like, we hung out a few times together, right? But most of the time, I didn't want to get too close to the bands. One, there were loads of people on the magazine that were a hell of a lot cooler than I was, right? And they were much better at doing that. But second, I just figured it wasn't the job of the editor of the NME to go and hang with loads of bands, because you needed that distance. And at some point, you were probably going to have to slag them off and cause some trouble. And if they were mates, that was going to be it was going to be a problem. So I knew the Horrors quite well. But, you know, even, and Franz I knew really well. But, you know, things like the Kaiser Chiefs, you know, they were from Leeds. I was from Bradford. We got on really well. I understood all of their reference points. And they were just really nice guys. But, you know, they went on the cover once and it absolutely fucking bombed. And it's like having to have a conversation with...
I could identify.
Yeah, having a conversation with the manager is like, this isn't going to happen again, right? I can't go back. Because there was no intrigue. The single's really big, but it went mainstream so quick, we didn't own it, right? There was nothing for us. I'd go to big gigs that they would do and I would hang out with them and it would be like, so what are you going to... It's like, no, it's not going to happen. So not hanging with bands was almost the thing that I did.
Fair play.
Yeah, but the Strokes were awkward. They were really, really fucking awkward. Every photo shoot, every interview, they were awful in interviews because they just weren't interested. They weren't those kind of guys. It's like, we were talking earlier on, and Jamie, you were talking about how, wanting to arrive with something to say, right, and hack pop culture and have an agenda, and the Strokes hadn't thought about it at all.
That surprises me because I thought the Strokes had, you look on the back of that CD, for example, and they've got taste in music and they come from kind of, I don't know, New York punk culture, and you thought they'd have arrived and they'd have had something to say. We're not replicating something that already existed, but they had a trajectory and they knew what they were trying to do. But yeah, I mean, we were 100% that thing. We, when you open the door to us, it's like, thank you. Yes, we're ready to talk to you and we're going to sell ourselves to you 100%. And thank you very much for listening and replicating our bullshit, basically. But yeah, having that opportunity to be in print media and knowing that was a chance and having a chance to have fun with it and to get people to, print what you were going to say to them, that was 100% part of the game for us. I'm surprised that other bands didn't come with an agenda and knowing like, we know what we want to achieve.
Yeah. Well, I always used to say, we the paper, we're not an audio medium, right? We are words and pictures, right? So we own the visuals and we own the story. And, I think I've said this before, it almost in some instances kind of didn't matter what the band sounded like, because the generation that were there before me were all very much like, it's about the music, man. It's like, it's great music. And I'm like, yeah, but if you look like shit, you're fucking useless to us. Because I need people I can put on the cover and people will be obsessed with.
Again, thanks for that, mate.
Yeah. It's like, because, either because they want to be them or they want to screw them, right? That's the way pop culture works. And so when the Horrors turned up, almost unlistenable, but they looked fantastic and every interview was brilliant. It was like, bam, straight on the cover. It was so bizarre. It was such a bizarre thing to do, to put them on the cover like that. But they were one of the few bands where, the music was allowed to kind of catch up with who they were. They were given a lifeline by XL and they managed on the second album to produce something which was amazing. And then the third one was a work of genius. And it was actually a much more old school trajectory. But bands that turned up and sounded fantastic, but actually, had nothing about them. It's like, you're a radio band, right? Go and speak to Radio 2, but I can't do anything with you.
I'm having an idea for our future media conversation that we were having outside earlier. I'm wondering, whether I've definitely want to talk about print media and like where that is these days and what that means, and is there a chance for a revival of that? And I miss that. I miss the idea that I miss knowing what people think. I miss knowing what my bands, what bands I'm into think, what their agenda is, what they're into, what are they gonna, what will I learn from something through another band? What are they going to teach me? What am I going to want to dive into? And I feel that without print media, I'm not getting that because I'm just finding out like what people are doing at this exact moment in time, and like that's nice and all good, but I'm like, I want more depth from it, and I miss reading about stuff. And my idea now, as you just spoken, was could the NME come back as a video blog? Could they video to get the thing, like, because you're saying like pictures and words, like how, if you put someone on the camera now, would they perform? Would you get what you want from them?
Well, I think everybody now is so media trained, and we were discussing earlier on that kind of that rock and roll chaos doesn't really have a value in the industry anymore. Particularly, you can see all the greatest videos of, people falling over and doing stupid stuff on TikTok 24/7. Whether they're famous or not, it doesn't matter. And, the single most valuable commodity in the entire industry now is the Spotify algorithm, and producing something that can game that algorithm and, get you on the right playlists is literally the only thing that matters. plus the occasional viral video. But even that is a door open, but it's not a guarantee because it's got no longevity. And people who are chaotic are actually, they're less used to the industry now because there's nobody around to document that stuff. There aren't snatched photos of people falling out of nightclubs and anecdotes. It has become a lot more tame, but that's because there's just access to everything everywhere all the time.
Yeah. And a good segue, chaotic bands, the Libertines. I did misquote you on the last episode with Anthony Thornton, because I said when it came to all kind of the antics of the Libertines and maybe the dark side, I said that you said that it's all part of it, it's just rock and roll. Or actually, you just said that about debauchery, where you said that actually the dark side of it gave you sleepless nights for the Libertines in terms of what the NME was promoting. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, if we can kind of transport ourselves back there, the nadir of the whole thing, where we talk about the kind of Libertines in inverted commas, but obviously there was that period post Libertines where Wolfman is knocking around and the whole Baby Shambles thing is going on, and there's just a load of people fucked on heroin, right, and taking a load of crack, and they're really quite exploitative of a lot of the fans. There are fans who have given hundreds, maybe even thousands of pounds to Pete and Pete's cronies as drug money for access to micro gigs and all of that sort of stuff. It was quite nasty. But there was I think it's interesting, this term indie sleaze, which didn't exist at the time. It wasn't a contemporary term.
That's why I brought these CDs.
Yeah.
So I knew we'd get there.
But that term indie sleaze has been kind of stuck on the scene afterwards, because it was that kind of griminess, and the griminess was exciting. But if the griminess is getting hammered and with your mates, in the back room of a pub in Barnsley, and putting on a gig and all that sort of stuff, that's kind of good sleaze, because that's about growing up and being stupid and making mistakes. But if there's lots of people taking crack all over the place, that's bad sleaze, people. So it was quite weird. These things were really important to people and you needed to document them, but at the same time you couldn't be seen to endorsing it. And it taught me, I don't know what the fuck I was doing. You just kind of, it was one of the things about the NME was, it by definition it was weekly, right? And so you just kind of, you only ever thought in terms of 7-day cycles. Just get the next one out and then history will look after itself.
Yeah, I mean,
Did you hang with them much?
Yeah, you fill the car and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I was the bass player in Dirty Pretty Things when they came back 2 years ago.
Oh yeah.
And I'm close. I consider Carl to be like a brother figure to me. I love him with all my heart. The other guys at the time, no, I didn't really hang around with. Like Carl's just always been a close friend of mine. So I was not around it. We were just sort of like friends with him. So no, I didn't see any of the darkness. But this is kind of what I brought this CD for, because I was just realizing, that these songs are on here. Some of them, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, Drinking Whiskey, they came out in like 1954 or whatever. They came out in 1956. It's quite literally like the history of rock and roll. It's not something new that an artist is around. Drug, sex, and rock and roll. It's like been going on forever. And I don't know, talk about sleepless nights and the rest of it. Why did you feel that there's like a sort of moral obligation not to be covering the idea that your rock star is out there and doing what traditionally rock stars have been doing since the beginning of recording music?
No, I didn't have a problem with that. And, prior to working on NME, I'd actually come out of dance culture, right? So I'd worked on Ministry magazine. I've been on Mixmag for 2.5 years. I've been editor of music. And there was a lot of drugs involved in that scene, right? A really quite fantastical amount of drugs involved in that scene, and it was quite open. Yeah. Sticking ecstasy pills on the cover of Mixmag, and we used to do the annual drug survey of Mixmag, and it was, I've spoken at a House of Commons select committee promoting the legalization of drugs and drug testing at festivals and all of that sort of thing, right? It was a really big part of that whole thing. But there was, there was a softness to those recreational drugs, particularly because it was ecstasy, and that's obviously very different from what was happening with that kind of Pete and Wolfman thing. The fear for me was that we would in any way end up glamorizing what was happening to those people. And the thing that gave me sleepless nights was that there would be some kid in some town in the UK who would think it was a really fucking good idea to take crack because Pete was taking crack and everyone thought he was amazing. And that was a responsibility.
100%, I get that. Yeah, absolutely. And I was just thinking about it because I remember there was I just remembered. I've been trying to think about it for weeks. Like, who was this guy's name? There was a kid. Actually, it doesn't matter now that I've remembered it, but it's nice that I do. There was a kid, and I remember hanging out with him outside a nightclub once, and we were doing loads of drugs, and he turned around to me and he went, "Oh, this is MDMA." And I was like, that's really funny. And I think I told one of your journalists, I can't remember who it was, and then the next week there was a sticker on the front of the NME said ND amazing. Oh, for fuck's sake, like what have we done, But as you were saying, like that I grew up with the glorification of ecstasy. I'd drawn ecstasy on my rough book at school as an 11-year-old because like I was into the Prodigy, etc. Rave culture was massive, and I glorified it before going anywhere near it. But that's what we were about. We were about doing rave drugs, and it was celebrated already. And I knew that the sort of dark side of. I'd read William Burroughs Junkie as a teenager, and I just thought, no thanks, that is not for me. I don't want anything to do with what I've seen on that page. And so being around that world of darkness is not for me. But I don't know. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but like sometimes as a musician, you get the thing where if you meet someone in the street, they'll come up to you and they'll say, "Oh man, I really like that album, thanks so much, it changed my life in some way, really appreciate your work, thanks for your record." The thing that I get more than anything ever is, "Oh mate, I took my first drugs at your gig." For fuck's sake, I'm so sorry, dude. Are you okay? And yeah, so I have both cherished memories and guilt, and the rest of it, surrounded by the idea that we were free to talk about it. We talked about drugs all day long at the NME, and we lapped it up, and my family were cool with it. So I was like, yeah, whatever. Like, I'm just going to tell you guys what I was doing last night. As a man who hasn't done drugs for 5 years, I feel quite happy talking about it too. But it was like, it felt exciting to be able to be honest about things, and for us to have that. I don't know if it wasn't dark in our world. It was like, let's do a load of drugs together and celebrate this. Let's hug a stranger, let's have a spiritual experience with a load of people we don't know in a room. It was never about us. It was always about having a great time with other people.
But it's the difference between uppers and downers, though, isn't it? It's like
stay away,
different
kids.
Personality types. Yeah.
You did matinee shows as well, didn't you? Someone was telling me.
Yeah, I think so. Speaking of doing drugs, we did. There was a tour where we did some afternoon shows because things got out of control at that point in time. I mean, we couldn't book enough shows. And it was really sweet because we had a younger audience, and it was like, cool. Well, there are people that want to buy the tickets, so it was like amazing. Like, yeah, let's do the shows. I remember sitting on a tour bus and looking out at like people queuing up to come in, and they're all like wearing our merch and whatever, and like I don't know what's going on anymore. But yeah, like fun, like bring kids. Like kids want to throw glow sticks in the air. It worked. It was good. I do a matinee show.
What year was that?
I think it was 2.6. I think it was 2.6 actually, 2.6 or 2.7. We will talk about 2.7, but I think 2.6 was like the real chaos.
Because I think around about that time, we started experimenting with Club NME daytime shows.
Okay.
Because we were talking earlier on how when the era when I took over NME, when the Strikes and the Stripes turned up, it was kind of 90% male readership, and by the time I left, it was 50-50 male female, right? And I was very proud of the fact that we'd not excluded anybody. That was the thing, just making sure that it is open to anybody who wants to be part of it. But also from a commercial point of view, right, girls drive pop culture much faster than men do, right? So, having that accessibility, that was a way for sales. But, one of the other things that we don't talk about much is actually the age of the readership went down significantly. So, rather than NME being a bunch of, kind of slightly obsessive 20-year-old men talking to each other about, whether one particular group of men playing guitars was better than another group of men playing guitars. You got this shift down where, kids of 13 or 14 years old were suddenly into this music, and that almost kind of cartoonish drama that you had, particularly around New Rave, was like, it was amazing, right? Why wouldn't you want to be part of that? And I thought the scene actually did a pretty good job of going, we need to meet these fans on their own terms, right? They can't go out to stuff in the evening. So let's do some matinee shows. Let's get Club NME opened. And certainly, for about a year, 18 months, that was definitely a thing that was going through.
The audience was there, and it was like, absolutely, like, let's cater to it, and it's amazing that passing the time. Hopefully they're the guys that will still buy tickets like these days.
Yeah. And then linking to mental health, because I was listening to your episode again, Conor, and you said your first ever 2 weeks at NME were hell on earth.
Yes.
But do you think, and it's like a football analogy you could make, and I hear a lot of older players.
It was hell for more than 2 weeks. It was hell for months, but yeah.
Like all the players now say that was, players now get it too easy, like a formative experience when they were younger, getting, abused essentially. Was it a formative, essential experience for you, or not really?
No, it was just fucking awful. Yeah, there was nothing to recommend it at all. I mean, I was totally out of my depth. And the worst thing is, the thing that still gives me this creeping cold fear was that everybody knew that I was totally out of my depth. Can you imagine? It's like you're there, you're supposed to be running this thing, and everyone goes, he's not fucking up to it, because I wasn't up to it at all. And I only survived because I'm actually the second youngest ever editor of NME. Ben Knowles, who was the one before me, beat me by 6 months. But essentially, we were the same age, both of us when we started. And the idea that you would give this editorship to somebody at 27 years old is just a bizarre idea now. But the idea was, you want to attract a new younger audience, so you get a younger editor. I survived because I had Steve Sutherland. Ben Knowles hadn't had Steve Sutherland because he'd been the one before him. So it's like, right, get him away from the magazine. But when I went in there, it was like, actually, Steve was kind of running it with me for, a good few months until I did the redesign. And then when I did the redesign, which was what this Strokes CD was on, I think that was on the cover of the first redesign. Everything that was light blue touch paper, Stanwell back, it just went from that moment on because everybody got it. But yeah, there was nothing to recommend it at all. It was just awful. Just feeling sick, walking across Blackfriars Bridge every morning, crying in the toilets at lunchtime, going, I am not up to this at all. But it in a way, it's like we were talking about, bands getting 2 or 3 albums to be able to kind of get their shit together and go, actually, now the moment of genius arrives. People backed me. That's what got me through. And eventually you get to a point where somebody lets go of the seat on the back of the bicycle, and eventually you're like, right, can all of you old guys just fuck off now, because I've got this, I really don't need you. And that was a good feeling. But yeah, I mean, the beginning bit was brutally stressful, and the end of it was brutally stressful as well. And most of the middle bit was quite stressful. I can look back on it with joy now, but and there are moments where it was great, but yeah, a lot of it was just chasing ever decreasing sales figures because the world had moved on and people weren't buying magazines.
Yeah. Well, how about you, Jamie? Like, did it ever become a factor, like mental health kind of thing, or were you just loving life?
It's an interesting one. That, I mean, these days I'm all about it and can speak the language and understand. But I think at that time, no, I don't even think it was part of the conversation. Like, I was in situations at the time where, like, I was all over the place, and no one would ever recommend that there was somebody that I should go and talk to about it, whatever, get myself a therapist. I highly recommend therapists for everybody. Like, having been through it myself for a while, I absolutely wish that I'd have done it so much younger. But there were times it just wasn't part of the conversation. No one was like, particularly, I think, I don't know, it was like, he's just, I don't know. It just sort of never came up. It wasn't a thing. But I can understand, when you talk about being under pressure as a 27-year-old, right? That was 100% what was going on with us. But I think that's part of being in music and being young, I think the history of that is like being young and being thrown in it and coming up with work and making something new and exciting. And that is the job of younger people to do that. You know, like no one wants to know what, I don't know, or you do, of course, like if you've got a history of an artist. But I think like music made by young people is what's really exciting, but not to, I mean, we weren't looked after. We were like left to our own devices for some time to do whatever we wanted for that period of time, and I'm grateful for it. You know, I didn't need an old man telling me what to do. I didn't need an old man telling me how to write a song. I didn't need being told any aspect of what we were trying to create. But I feel good that these days mental health, just those two words are used in consideration with young artists. I've been working with young artists for years, and the managers will check in with them, like, how you doing? Like, what's going on with you? And if you can see that, I mean, they're writing about emotionally honest stuff these days. Like, I never wrote an emotionally honest song in my 20s. And then if you can see a younger kid doing that now, you can see that maybe there's something going on with them, wonder if they're all right with what they're talking about or whatever. But there seems to be more consideration, and I think that's essential, you know.
Yeah. And then in terms of your relationship with NME, you said that you had people in the media that you knew, you had contacts that helped you immediately like have that rapid rise. How does that come to be as a 25-year-old?
Because there was a guy who was at Goldsmiths University, and he was a journalist at Vice magazine, Jamie Hodgson, who went on to work for you guys. And we were just friends with him, because at the time we started in 2000, at the end of 2005, and the record label that we signed to, Angular Records, was run by a guy called Joe Daniel. And he was putting out records from bands from New Cross, including, we were talking about them before, Art Brut, Block Party. There were two really good compilations. And I'd read about him in the NME. And there was a feature on Angular Records. And I knew, I was working in a record shop in Greenwich at the time. And I knew that he was just around the corner with this whole scene bubbling that I'd read about in the NME. And I sort of beeline to be friends with him. And so he had friends. And then Jamie was a part of that. There was just a really vibrant scene happening in New Cross in 2005, 2006. And I was DJing at the time, working in a record shop, and I sort of saw it and made myself, put myself in that position around those guys. So by the time that was 2004, 2003, 2004. So by the time the band formed at the end of 2005, we just sort of had those mates around us. Were like, oh, they could write. He wrote our first article was in Vice magazine, and then we're friends with club promoters, and we just went out and we put our own thing on. And people that would do, there were lots of club nights going on at the time, and people we'd all be at the same parties, we'd all be at the same event. Like at that time, there was something to do every night of the week. You know what night of the week it was because you'd be in that nightclub. You're like, oh, it's Monday, I'm in Trash. Oh, it's Tuesday, I'm at White Heat. Like that's how you knew what day of the week it was. And so that vibrant scene of connected people, they were the people that helped us elevate straight away. You know, we were already plugged into it before we made any music. So by the time the music was ready, we were just like, hey guys, here we are, we're good, help us out. It worked.
And that what you've just described there was what I loved about it, right? Because by the time you guys turned up, you know, we'd been through the Strokes and Stripes thing. You know, we'd had Block Party and Franz Ferdinand and the Kings of, you know, all the K bands, Kings of Leon, Killers, Kasabian. I think I'd elevate you beyond that from a cultural point of view. But Kaiser Chiefs is the other K band, and but what you just described there of like record labels, record shops, club nights, gigs, journalists, is that multi-dimensional cultural thing. I wasn't anywhere near it, but I recognised it. I could feel it bubbling through the magazine, and it's like that's the thing. And that setup, you know, is exactly, it was the same in the 60s, it was the same in the 70s. You look at the Blitz Club in the 80s, you know, it's exactly the same multi-dimensional thing. It isn't just, and that's what used to do my head in about the kind of, it's all about the Music Man guys, because they were always guys. And it's like, you know, no, it isn't. It's about what you look like. It's about the story that you're telling. It's about who you're hanging out with. That's culture. That's, you know, I didn't love the Beatles just because of what they put out and as recorded music. I love the difference in the the narrative drama between albums. I loved, Epstein, who was this gay man who was curating this amazing moment of pop culture in London. All of these dimensions that were going on. The early NME feeding off the Beatles and the Beatles feeding off the NME. That's what a scene is. That's what Malcolm McLaren understood. That's what was going on with the KLF, and you guys had that right from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. It just felt very, very vibrant. London felt very, very. I moved to London when I was 18, and between like being 18 and 25, it was just really alive. I lived for club culture. I lived for going out to see. I was more into club culture than bands, but I grew up in bands in the 90s, so I loved Britpop, and then all of a sudden like Electro Clash, and I was like, yes, club culture. This is amazing. So I really, by my time, I just melded the two things together. I've been doing it for a long time already at that point, but yeah, it was just alive, and I don't know what it compares like these days, but there were people just from all doing little. Everyone was doing different things, but you all met in the nightclub, and there was something to do every single night of the week, and that was London felt alive to me at that point in time.
Yeah, and then moving on to the cool list, I noticed that. Do you remember where you finished in 2007?
Yeah, I talked about a resentment towards Frank Carter yesterday. Yeah.
Yes, you were second behind Frank Carter.
So that list is so crazy, and we haven't ever spoken about that, have we? So I've never.
I don't think so, because I wanted to know how it went down with the rest of the band.
Well, that's why I'm sitting here feeling guilty about it now, because I know they'll probably listen to this and they'll be like, "You're still an arsehole. Like, why was I on that list?" The truth is, we never spoke about it. I don't think we ever had a conversation about it. Of course, privately, I'm like, yeah, I'm the second coolest person in the world, fuck you all. But like, yeah, no, between each other, no, I don't think we ever spoke about it. I think that was probably the most awkward thing that could have happened, and just didn't. It was as if it didn't happen, but privately, I was very happy.
Yeah,
I was on it a couple of times, and it was a thing, like, oh, where am I? And they're like, oh, I'm not on that page. Oh, what? That's yes. Frank Carter should be singing the Sex Pistols as the coolest person in the world, and now he's in the Sex Pistols. It makes sense.
Yeah.
But everyone loves a list, right? For 2 years, the Evening Standard, they used to run something called the 1,000 most influential people in London. And I got somebody going, "Have you seen that you're on the list?" I went, "What the fuck do you mean I'm on the list?" And I was listed as one of the 1,000 most influential people in London.
Definitely were.
Yeah, for 2 years running. And it was like, fuck. I remember Chris York, bless him, R.I.P., because he passed away fairly recently. I remember him texting me and going, "What the fuck are you doing on this list?" That was amazing, yeah. I got invited to a party which featured the 1,000 most influential people in London, and I turned up and I didn't know anybody. I knew absolutely nobody, and I sat there and I grabbed a glass of champagne and I kind of wandered around and I thought, this is fucking awful, and then just turned around and left. Yeah.
And then I don't think we chatted about NME TV and NME Radio. NME TV, like, was that kind of the peak of NME's powers? It was like, right, we're going to start a TV station.
God, I wish that was the case. Okay. That would be lovely, wouldn't it? It was more. From a commercial point of view, we weren't selling as many magazines as we did historically, right? Because people just weren't buying magazines in the same way. We realised that actually we, as a magazine, you were competing with mobile phone top-up cards a lot of the time, right? Because if you've got £5 in your pocket, are you going to spend it on the NME, which is probably about £2 at that point, or are you going to buy a top-up card which might connect you with a party or a friend, or it's like, that's easy. That's you're going to lose out there. So, and people were just not hanging around newsstands in the way that they used to. I mean, this feels like 100 years ago now, but 20, 25 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, if you went into any major station, you go into W.H. Smith or John Menzies, and they'd have a massive rack of magazines. It would take up half the store, and it was just filled with people milling about, finding something, because you needed something to kind of fill those periods when you're on the train. And now you go into them and it's like, there's tiny, tiny little racks of magazines and nobody's there because they got their phones. Why would they bother?
Some chewing gum for the anxiety, watching whatever's on your phone.
Yeah, totally. Get a can of CBD and that's about it. And so we needed to find other ways of making money because that's one of the great things that people hate it, but one of the great things about NME is it's a commercial entity, always has been. And that's what's forced it. I liked it because it was almost a kind of an Andy Warhol thing, right? You were playing between art and commerce, and you needed to do stuff, and cultural relevance was about making money and vice versa. And so you suddenly go, well, what is the value of NME? The value of NME is connecting inspiring music artists with culture-hungry young music fans. That's what you do, right? And as soon as you establish that, the magazine becomes almost the least interesting way of doing it, because it's not an audio platform, right? So you suddenly go, right, radio's a really good idea, TV's a really good idea. There was lots of money around, people were prepared to do deals. So TV was done with one company, radio was done with another organisation. The fact was that because they were joint ventures, we never totally had control over what was going out. And what worked in those channels didn't necessarily work on the NME and vice versa. So my role eventually became, curating this toy box. I always felt like, so I had the magazine, I had, 5-6 national tours a year, merchandise arm, ticketing arm, NME TV, NME Radio, the NME Awards in London and America, as we did at one point, and making it all work together. And what was interesting, I used to, you realize how much these things mean. I remember getting a letter from some kid who basically said, fucking make up your mind, because in the magazine you slag off the Kaiser Chiefs all the time, but you're playing them back to back on NME TV. So does NME love the Kaiser Chiefs or doesn't it? And you go, whoa, you can't hide from this stuff, right? They put it together. They expect it to be what I eventually learned to know was a brand experience, right? Consistency. But it was really hard getting NME TV off the ground. Just one last story on that. The thing with TV at the time, it's been replaced by YouTube now, but at the time you couldn't get TV figures unless somebody had a Barb box, right? So Barb was the organisation that would measure TV viewing, right? And Barb, the organisation, didn't like giving these boxes to people within our age group, which was kind of like 16 to 22, because they tended to break them, get them nicked because their houses were broken into, right? So there was massive underrepresentation of that audience in terms of the TV figures. So people were watching it, but because they didn't have boxes, nobody noticed, right? And so if you could get somebody who had a Barb box to watch it, then suddenly your quid's in. And we were looking at the kind of viewing figures for NME TV, and I remember getting being pulled into a meeting where the viewing figures had been kind of like bouncing along the bottom, and suddenly they skyrocketed because clearly somebody with a Barb box had actually switched onto NME TV, and as a percentage it had been extrapolated to this massive viewing figure, and it was like fuck, what were we doing at that point? And they were running like a Streets video special, like 5 Streets videos back to back. And it was like, right, fuck. The Streets went on like every third video on NME TV, because you're chasing that one person with a Barb box, because if they watch it, the numbers go up and you can suddenly sell advertising off the back of it. But yeah, the whole thing, looking back, was absolute chaos, but good fun.
And you mentioned the idea of turning on bands or being a bit too first, something that I often see in comments about NME. And I remember like a caricature was made of like the Paddingtons, the others, and all these. You could say like the crowd of the Libertines. Is that something you were aware of? Were you bothered that you were turning on people, or did it feel like you were turning on people, or not really?
I think you could only really do the job if you kept a healthy distance, which is why I tried not to hang out with bands. I think I met the Pigeon Detectives once, but I didn't. I mean, there were so many bands, and look, when you got something like the Horrors, right, that was precious. That needed looking after. Those guys were great. They were clearly going to do something. I mean, you guys turned up kind of fully formed, right? So, that was just kind of like give you a platform. But there are other artists where you're like, right, this is special. This is important. And then loads of other stuff where you go, look, you're going to have your time in the sun and that's great and everything, but this is not going to go anywhere because there's just not enough that's interesting about it. And at the end of the day, you know, we were there to serve the readers, you know, and I've talked about it before, you know, I always had in my head that person who works Saturday job in Doncaster and they're going out on Saturday night and their money is really fucking precious. And if you're going to ask them to spend, you know, it was £1.50 when I started and about £2.50 when I ended, right? This means something to them, right? So the only person you're serving is the reader, not the bands, right? The bands, you know, they're there to look after themselves. And if they want to cut through, write some better records. But no, the only person I worried about was the readers.
Were you like ever wary of being like having such focus on you early on, Jamie, because of that?
Because people could be mean. Like, I don't know. I don't know. I think I grew up with that culture. Like, I loved reading the NME and the NME, like, being mean about something. Like, it was almost like part of the currency. Like, and of course, like, you could have been mean about us all day long. We threw ourselves open to that. It was, you know, you could take the piss out of us continuously. But I don't know. There was something about that being part of its edge, and like you had to. It meant something to everybody. It meant something not only to the reader but to the band. I don't know. I didn't ever meet anybody that had a gripe with it or whatever. But that idea that you had to be good enough so not to have the piss taken out of you felt like a part of being in a band. Like the whole time, for as far as I remember, like reading the NME. Sometimes it was confusing, and it wasn't just straightforward and informative. Like there was that opportunity to take the piss out of somebody, to be mean about something, to drive culture in a way, and then, like you say, write a better record, come back round, whatever it is. You knew it was almost a game in a way that I think that I don't know, it doesn't exist anymore, and it seems like an old way of doing things now about being mean about something. Just seems now like just wouldn't work. But at that time, I don't know. It felt to be to be engaged in that game with the press and that opportunity, so as to be able to not only be celebrated but put down or said things about you that just don't make any sense, and everyone have that real emotional connection to that opportunity. Everyone knows what they're doing by getting involved in it. You know, that was what it felt like it was, you know. And I felt like I liked that. That was like part of it, and yeah, I kind of miss that element of media in a sense.
And then one last story before the break. Then Conor, Anthony Thornton and Matt Tong had their say on it. Block Party winning Album of the Year in 2005, but Matt Tong said it was tainted because there was a heavy rumour that Arcade Fire was supposed to win. According to Anthony, that was because the sponsors were after a list really early and they hadn't got all the votes in. Do you have any recollection of this?
Yeah, I have a lot of recollection of this. It was a fairly vivid moment. Yeah, it was a prick in the fucking advertising department, and it's like, you know, those guys, you know, it was IPC, right? They used to call it the Ministry of Magazines, and those guys, most of them that were selling on NME, speaking to the big media houses, you know, they were just jobbing magazine advertising salespeople, right? They had no affinity. There were some who really keyed into it and, you know, really cared about what was going on, but most of them didn't, right? It was just a job to them. And one of them, as I recall it, there was a guy who was really fucking pushy, and he'd come to me and said, look, if I'm going to go off and start selling some advertising, you need to give me a heads up as to where things are going so that I know who to speak to. You know, can you share a kind of like an interim voting list with us so I can see how things are going? And it's like, yeah, okay, as long as you don't share it with anybody, right? And what did he do? He went off and emailed it to a load of people because he had no idea the ramifications of doing this. He emailed this interim voting list to a whole load of people, going, you should really book some advertising because, you know, this thing is doing this. And it's like, what the fuck? You know, and stuff changed right up until the last minute. That was one of the struggles with the NME Awards was, you know, trying to, where's the cutoff point. But, you know, it's how great an album is Silent Alarm. I mean, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So I've no problem with that at all.
And when you won it, Jamie, if a rumour came out about someone else maybe supposed to be winning it, would it bother you?
No, I don't know. No, not at all. I don't think so. We take everything on the chin. I mean, winning something, it definitely meant something. It's huge. It's a really, really big deal. But no, there's never any sort of grievance if it went to somebody else. I mean, like we won awards, we didn't win awards. It didn't matter. It was always a surprise. Like winning something, it didn't feel like our right to win something. It was just really lovely when it happened. Like, I felt we weren't particularly competitive. I don't think we were more sort of like everyone's mate rather than like being competitive with people and being worried that somebody else is going to win something. No, I don't think so. We were just grateful for everything that went on and just like surprised by everything and just bang up for it, But I do think we were the better band and deserved it.
Well, on that note, let's have an intermission. I think half an hour for drinks, and then if you've got some questions for the second half, be most welcome. So yeah, cheers. Right, who's first then? Anyone want to volunteer? Well, actually, we've got one from Martin, who emailed one across. If I can read my own writing. For both of you, I think, were there any bands that you really liked and you thought should have been big that didn't really go anywhere?
Yeah, there were definitely bands that, I don't know, I had a reputation for having a terrible taste in music. Right, and there's quite often stuff that I'd be banging on about, and everyone would be like, "What on earth are you talking about?" So I learned to find, we used to call it people with good ears, people on the staff who actually, were much more connected in than I was. But one of them, was the track was actually played earlier on this evening was White Rose Movement, and Love Is a Number. God, I still don't understand why that wasn't a massive hit. It's such a great track. Errol Alkan produced it. It's just amazing. And it's the great thing about social media. Ended up having years later a Twitter conversation with Errol and telling him how much I love that track, and him talking about how he'd ripped off the bass line sound, and he gave me the reference from where he'd ripped it off from and all that sort of thing. But yeah, there's the things that kind of fall through the cracks, but it's what we were talking about earlier on. It isn't enough just to have a really great tune. You've got to, and it isn't just all of the visual and narrative stuff that goes with it. You, as you know, Jamie, with the work that you do now, you've got to have a team behind you who know what they're doing. And a lot of the time, people didn't, and things fell to bits. And the opposite of that almost is the Fratellis, who who had a mate. Who had a really chaotic team that I think it's fair to say everybody in the industry absolutely hated. But they had Chelsea Dagger, right? And if you got Chelsea Dagger, you ruled the world. And they did for an album, and then it all went south.
And your second question was just, what was your favourite album or band of the whole era?
For me, I think
Klaxons.
That's very, very sweet. It definitely wasn't. For me, I think it was Strokes' Is It. It was the one. Because it was the one. That's why I brought these CDs, because at that time it wasn't that music was stale, but I definitely heard it. I loved Primal Scream, I loved Radiohead, I loved Oasis, but like I'd also gone through the kind of late 90s dance music, and I was sort of over guitars by that point. And in 2001, the NME was still talking about guitar bands, and I was kind of into the Badly Drawn Boy album, but like, whatever, really. I preferred the Chemical Brothers going out clubbing. Music, like club music, felt far more exciting to me. And then when the Strokes dropped the Is This It record, I'm like, oh, the music that I loved in the 90s just got back and better, and like guitar music felt relevant again. And I think that spirit of like being back into guitar music, that album is the one that did it. And I always like go back to it and think, yeah, that's the some if it wasn't for that, it influenced so much stuff. It spread from there, so I was just like grateful for that record. I just love it. I think that's the one.
What did you make like the following records? Like, I suppose there's mixed reception maybe on second and third albums, but I don't know.
I loved one of the songs on it, and then I didn't listen to it.
Really?
I never did after that.
On Room on Fire?
Yeah, there's one tune on that I really, really loved. But then it was weird. I went from being like completely obsessed to like moving on and not really caring. But yeah, I don't know. It's just that one record. Yeah.
Yeah, fair play. Any questions out there?
if it's not too personal, could we ask
That's all good. I'm happy to talk about that.
what you do?
Yeah. I was a rock star in my 20s, and these days I do a mixture of stuff. I help young artists. I was a songwriter for a couple of years, and so I do sessions with young artists, and I help them write songs. I've developed a couple of artists I've been doing it for about 3 or 4 years. I had a couple of bands. I did another band after my last band, after the band that was successful, and then I went into songwriting. And I help young people write tunes, and I've been doing some teaching in schools, which was one of the things that I really find really helpful. I've been teaching kids songwriting, and while I was doing that, I found a couple of talented kids that me and my friend are managing and looking after. A really talented young electronic house producer, and a guy that makes classical music who I think is like absolute genius, who like we really want to help to become the best artist they possibly can. I mean, my thing is songwriting, and I help people write songs.
Is it more individuals and bands these days, though, do you find?
Yeah, 100%. I don't know if you saw, I saw that thing recently with what's his name?
Richard Osman.
Richard Osman, yeah, exactly. I saw that, and that statistic's just mental, isn't it? The fact that there's the amount of songs that have been in the charts that are from bands are so few these days. I don't know. I'd be interested in Conor's opinion on that. Like, why? I mean, I've certainly written songs with individuals. Yeah, it's just like people they may have a band around them at the end of working with them and having a bunch of songs. They're like, oh, I've got an album here. I need a band to go out and play, and then they go and find themselves a band and take themselves out. But they don't. I've not worked with any. I've worked with like Reverend and the Makers or something who already existed before. But they're the younger people I've worked with are all individuals. Yeah, they've come to me with a collective group looking for songs. No, I don't know. I'd definitely be interested in Conor's opinion as why aren't there many bands anymore?
Yeah, I think the culture isn't that. It's probably not a bad thing that we don't have so many bands anymore. Bands. I think when you look at it through the lens that we have now, which is more balanced and more socially aware, it was an enormously male-dominated scene, right? And it was this paradigm really that the Beatles had put in place, which is, it should be 4 lads against the world, coming out of somewhere in the north, ideally. That was the paradigm, right? And everybody was looking to sign that. And the reality was any band that didn't have all male membership was immediately on the back foot, weirdly. It just became, because it didn't feel somehow rock and roll. And I think there's been a purging of that from the industry. That's actually not a bad thing. And that the kind of self-imposed regulation for festivals that, at least 50% of the bill should be with, acts that have at least one female member. That's a really valuable thing. So I think not having, that paradigm being broken is probably not a bad thing. But the reality is that from a commercial point of view, it doesn't make sense anymore, right? Because if you're getting the money through streaming, then you want to make sure that you've got as few people involved as possible, because that it's the track that's making money, not the band, and therefore everybody who's involved is going to make more money if you've got fewer members. It's one of the reasons why the Polyphonic Spree didn't break through in quite the way they would like. Although, bless them, they did give us St. Vincent, so everything turned out all right in the end. But yeah, bands. I don't know. It's just as an idea, I think bands are just less interesting, and I think we'd got to that point where it was like actually this notion of kind of like 4 lads against the world and coming from the north of England doesn't make any difference and we should be looking for something else. And then the Arctic Monkeys turned up and you're like, okay, fine, yeah, whatever.
Any more questions?
Hello. Just something I always wondered about, particularly of you, Jamie, was like, obviously I'm aware you're sober now. Congratulations, very good. But I always think like in 06, 07, the idea of like Klaxons dressed like a bunch of lunatics going down Peterborough High Street trying to pick up drugs on like a Friday night. Would drug dealers like end up backstage, or would you sort of like have to go into Wetherspoons and try and pick up, or Like, genuinely.
So the question is, where do we get our drugs from?
It's essentially what I was saying, but like, it's one thing you're out on the street doing it, but Klaxons in 06 in a foreign high street.
No,
just
I
like-
remember where was it? I don't want to name the city. Actually, it doesn't matter. But I just remember walking down the street and someone taking one look at us and being like, "You are arseholes." Yep. No. We had a drug guy with us the whole time. That was the gig. Like, he was. The people had different gigs within our circuit. I can't throw anybody under the bus, but it's one guy's job to bring drugs with him. But it was one guy. His first question, he got to the venue, and before we used to go in there, and I remember he would walk into the venue, be right. Anyone got any drugs? And then the next minute, 2 hours go by, and he's like, "Oh fuck, we got a load of gear. We got a load of gear," and start setting up the gig. You know, it was crazy and stupid, and that was the whole idea. We were just taking the that 24-hour party people idea just through the roof and really enjoying it.
I suppose that's a nice segue into the NME Awards. Any stories that we haven't already heard? I mean, you were both at the American one that you think you called it a shambles. Can't have something.
It was a brilliant show. I mean, it drove me mad. I mean, it was done absolutely on a shoestring. I'm sure the people who were involved won't mind me saying now. I vividly remember there was a guy called, it's a very good friend of mine, Paul Cheel, who, you know, I get a lot of credit for, you know, taking the NME multi-platform and all the things we achieved. I was kind of the front man for it. Paul Cheel, who was the publishing director, you know, he was doing a lot of the thinking. He was making the deals work, right? And the two of us working together was really what fueled that expansion. But I remember flying over to LA and, you know, as we you know, kind of looking out the window, you know, you kind of arc over the city as you're coming into LAX. And the two of us looking at each other going, what the fuck are we doing here? You know, we've got the El Rey Theatre on Wilshire Boulevard booked. We've got all of this stuff going on, and it's like we're about to go into the, you know, the absolute, you know, the motherlode of entertainment as the NME, and we're going to make this happen. And we didn't have enough money. The IPC, who owned NME, had a rule which is every new venture had to make money inside of a 12-month period, right? Which, if you were doing an award ceremony, makes no sense whatsoever. And we'd got to a point, you know, we'd put together a kind of a 5-year business plan where, you know, you lose money the first 2 years, you break even third, and you make an absolute packet 4-5. You know, it was like, no, absolutely, you need to make money, and the numbers didn't add up. And we knew flying in there over LA that, you know, we were set to make a loss, and we were fucked. And you know, it was like, we're just going to do it anyway. We'll find a way to make this happen. The UK ran like clockwork, right? Lots of very professional people, some of whom were in the audience tonight, who really knew what they were doing, right? And it was an amazing event. You didn't even have to think about it. In America, it was a totally different ball game because we were working with suppliers that we didn't really know, and, you know, the production company wasn't who we would usually use, and nothing went right that night. And I was used to the NME Awards being this kind of slick affair because, you know, we'd really kind of, you know, we had it humming in the UK, and it was all over the place. And it was only afterwards that the Americans were coming over and saying, we've never seen anything like this, because they're used to slick award ceremonies. They're like, this was the wildest party we've ever been to, because it was just so all over the place. And that actually was the joy of it. I hated it at the time because I was a perfectionist, right? I knew how I wanted it to be, and it wasn't that at all. But the weird thing was we did end up breaking even, and we broke even because Ron Jeremy, the porn star, actually, you know, without knowing it, underwrote the whole thing. So we were, you know, I remember we'd done the whole event with all the kind of chaos that had gone on, and you know, we had this ridiculous guest list of various people from LA, one of whom was Ron Jeremy. And I'd met Ron Jeremy's, you know, kind of man who makes stuff happen. He was this big kind of 6'4" guy with long blonde hair, and he'd introduced himself. And at the end of the night, this guy, you know, youngish guy, came up to me and he said, Ron has had the most amazing night of his life, right? And what he would like to do is, so the El Rey Theatre is it's like this 1920s cinema, and it had all of these kind of boxes on the front for the cinema posters, right? So that's where all the gig posters used to be. And we'd taken all these over and we'd printed stuff out and we'd put them up. And I remember doing that artwork in the NME office and getting it all designed. I took it over in a cardboard tube on the plane. That's how low rent the whole thing was. And I remember kind of putting them up in these boxes outside. And this guy said, Ron would really like to take something away from the night as a memory. And he said he really loves the posters out front. He was wondering, if he could buy them off you. Right. And I'm absolutely bladdered by this point. And I'm going, yeah, absolutely. We can do that, but it's going to cost you. Right. I remember, two bits of my brain. One was telling him this story of how, well, actually all the work is copyrighted to the person who did it in the UK. So for you to have it in the US, that's quite an expensive bit. Just making up a load of bullshit, right? To try and increase the perceived value of these things. And then also trying to work out we're down £10,000 on this event, right? That was the amount that we knew we were kind of live for. And there were 6 posters, and very drunk, trying to divide 10,000 by 6 to work out how much each individual poster was worth. And that bit of the brain was not really working. And eventually, we came to, I said, look, if, you could have the whole thing as long as you don't tell anybody, right? But it'll cost you £10,000. And the guy went, that's absolutely fine. We can do that. And he transferred the money the next day, and Ron Jeremy paid for the whole thing. And like a lot of my anecdotes, especially with Russell Brand, those kind of stories were worth an awful lot more before he got accused of a whole load of sex crimes afterwards. But, such is the way of the music industry.
I mean, how much would you look forward to events like that, Jim? I mean, we were talking earlier about maybe bands not seeing much of each other until they got to those kind of events. What was it like?
Yeah, it was like the cherry on the cake, wasn't it? It's like you go there and wow, they're your contemporaries all standing in the room, and like I was saying before, we were friends with everybody. There was never like any animosity between us and another band or whatever. So it was chaos. I knew I was going there to get shit faced and to see loads of my friends and for something crazy to happen. Yeah, it was just like really, really fun and wild and unexpected, and seeing unexpected people. Like I didn't expect that night of the NME Awards in LA to be like talking to Alice Cooper at the end of the night, and telling him how much I loved like his music. It's just very strange, like unexpected, wild stuff going on, completely out of my mind and not knowing what's about to happen, and then probably like saying too much to some people, and then at the end of it going home and wondering what the fuck just happened. Like that was the spirit of it, and this chaos, and I loved it.
Yeah.
And LA was particularly wild because, it's like Kelly Osbourne was there and Agnes Dean, who was massive at the time. It was proper seat of the pants stuff.
I was racking my brains to think of a story that might have happened that night, and I'm pretty sure it must have been, and I'm not trying to get someone to driving under the influence ban. I know that man doesn't drink now either, but I remember the at the end, I think it must have been at the end of that night, there was I ended up in a car with Harmar Superstar, and it was the two of us. It was just the two of us listening to Harry Nilsson and deciding that we were going to form a duet where we sounded like Harry Nilsson, and it never happened. And I want to put that out that probably we should go back to it.
Yeah, I've a vivid memory of kind of finishing that gig, and everyone went back to hotels and parties and stuff, and then it had been scheduled to be just before Coachella, so that we could get bands were in town, and we kind of bring them into the awards, and then we go afterwards. And the next day, driving down from LA down to Palm Springs, and one of my very good friends who's in the audience tonight had been to Tower Records and bought a best of Elton John, and all of us desperately hungover, really needing the sunglasses. And, having Elton John playing in the car as we went down, with all of us singing our hearts out as we headed down to Coachella, is a very precious memory.
Now this makes sense, and I'm okay to tell. I think I'm all right to tell this story. It was Coachella afterwards, and that's why we were there. And I went to that show, and that's why I was hanging out with Mark Ronson, because I sang Daniel Merriweather's "Stop Me If You Can't," if you've heard this one before, Smith's cover, as Daniel Merriweather with Mark Ronson at Coachella that year. It was a real honour. I got to be Morrissey for the night, and I really loved it, and to sing that song. While we were waiting to go on, before we went on to that show, David Hasselhoff turned up.
Maybe.
And David Hasselhoff was sure that I was Mark Ronson and that Mark Ronson's name was John Johnson, and there's a photograph where he was bugging me to produce his next record, and he's pointing at me like, "You're John Johnson, you're going to produce my next record." I'm looking at Mark and Mark's looking at me. It's online. It's fucking brilliant.
And we were saying earlier on that night, you were saying you were out front on the stage with the lectern, doing award stuff with Mark, and I was backstage behind the velvet curtain, and I was waiting backstage because after that we were going to give the Godlike Genius Award to Jane's Addiction that we just reformed after very many years, quite timely. We might have to do that job again in another 15 years. And I was standing there, nervous, about to go on stage, and I can hear kerfuffles in front of me. And suddenly, through the velvet curtain, Mark Ronson just falls backwards bodily. And so I'm standing there and I'm looking down, and Mark Ronson is just lying on his back, staring up at me at the ceiling. And I'm like, "What the fuck are you doing?" And he's like, "Hi, Conor, how are you?" And it's like his feet are sticking out on the stage and he's having a conversation with me behind the curtain. And I think that was the moment where I went, I've totally lost control of this entire thing.
That's also worth looking up. There's a photograph online of the velvet curtain and 2 feet coming up from underneath the velvet curtain. That's Mark having fallen over. It was
Chaos.
Any more questions?
Hiya. So, Conor, I really love how you talk about culture and how actually at the time it was really important for the cover of NME to reflect what young people were into that week, not necessarily older people. And obviously it's really fascinating now how this kind of TikTok generation are talking about indie sleaze. And what do you kind of think they've got right about that? And what do you think they've got really wrong when they talk about their interpretation of that era?
Wow. I think you're right. It was really important to recognise what was new and what was and not necessarily what was old. But if you don't mind, it's a little bit of rose-tinted spectacles, right? Because you have to understand that as editor, what I loved and the thing that we've been talking about is that kind of cultural curation, right? It's like, the heroes are, Malcolm McLaren, KLF, what was happening at the Blitz Club in the 80s, that sense of going, everything that's old is shit, and we're gonna actively build a new thing, right? And we don't even know what it is yet, but have you seen our eye makeup, right? That's literally what has fueled each generation. And that was brilliant. And I was passionate about that, right? Because I wanted to make a cultural impact, right? Because I was young and I just wanted to have done something that meant something. The reason that I kind of survived so long at the NME was the flip side of that people don't see is it's a commercial entity, right? And your job is one fucking job, which is sell as many copies that week as you possibly can. And new bands don't sell. Right, established bands sell, but the right established bands, which is why the reality is the band that appeared, I think, on the cover the most times during my entire era at the NME was Holds Up CD Oasis, right? Because they just sold, they did numbers, right? And so you went back to them and back to them. And you're always hunting for those big bands that will do it. Green Day sold, Muse sold. New bands, you would always take a punt. You knew there'd be a dip, but you're trying to build people that you can kind of, make happen. So I think there is, people look at it, I really like the fact that everybody projects their own agenda onto that era, right? And for some people, it was like this incredible time of new music, and it was, but a lot of that was actually happening inside the papers. And what was happening on the cover was quite often a kind of a commercial decision. But Paul Cheall, one of the most precious things that Paul Cheall ever did, and I've taken it with me, and I talk to, people in business about it a lot, is that he gave me permission to fail. So the way the numbers worked is that you would publish publicly the average of all of your sales over a 6-month period, right? So nobody knows what sold and what hasn't, apart from us internally, but we just give them an average over that period. And the game was to make sure that number was more than the last 6-month period and more than that same period the previous year. It's all that mattered, right? And he said to me, he said, during that 6-month period where we see the figures and nobody else does, you should fail at least once spectacularly, right? Because if you fail at least once, you know that you're trying new things. So if you do that early in the sales period, you don't try it again. If you do it late, right, that means you probably tried a whole load of things that are new. And one of the things that came out of that, one of the random things that we did was put the Mighty Boosh on the cover. And this was right at the end of that kind of period that I was in. I was speaking to somebody who's just been going back through the Boosh. And if you look at those, if you watch those, I think it's 3 series, by the end of that 3rd series, you can't tell the difference between the NME and the Mighty Boosh. It's like the horrors are on there. They're in skinny jeans. They're in a band. It's like the whole thing had just merged into one. It's fucking amazing. It was phenomenal. And so these people are comedians, they're not rock stars, and we put them on the cover and sales just went ping, and it was like, fuck. So actually they were one of the biggest selling artists that we had towards the end of it. It's why they got a Christmas cover, all of that sort of thing, because we're just hunting for sales wherever we can find them. And actually that commercial lens probably doesn't get talked about an awful lot because they don't see it from my perspective. I knew what was going on, but everybody sees it from their own place.
I have an opinion about that question. I don't know, maybe. One of the things I'm really grateful for is that there wasn't social media while we existed, because like so much of what we were doing, I'm glad. Like that there is no footage of Klaxon's entire career. There's no there is not the guy that made our videos. He has some. He had a camcorder and he came back to some gigs and he's got a little bit of it, but all of it are like cherished memories. There's nothing on there that there is no recorded history other than what we remember between ourselves and the times that we had. And I don't know, I sort of cherish those memories. And now to see, like, I think when that Indie Sleaze thing came out, I remember the Instagram coming out, and initially it felt like nostalgia. And all my friends were like, wow, have you seen that there's nostalgia for our generation? Like, wow. And it was during lockdown, so we were like, oh my God, I'm alone in the world. But all of a sudden that nostalgia makes me feel good, And it's like, cool. We can tap back into weren't our 20s great? Like, life's a bit mental right now, but weren't our 20s awesome? And we were like saying, and championing that time. And it felt really good. And then now as it's moved on a little bit in time, I can see that for sure, that there's like younger people looking back at that and then using it as a point of reference. But it seems to be, if it's fashion, isn't it? It's not music. Like, it's not music. It's not, if it was like kids just going out and filming, if they were filming what we were doing at that time, I could have seen it. If they're going out, if they want to replicate that time, go out and be in a band with your mates, go out to nightclubs, go and like be in rehearsal rooms, go out down, like get involved with like the kind of people in your area and put things on, the way I was describing how like the scene happened before. Like now to dress in certain clothes doesn't mean that like you're only like replicating something that previously existed. And I think you're right, like to like create something, it's not you see a load of cool people walking around, but it's like, yeah, cool, you guys should be in a band, or like you guys should do something, but it turns out like they're not, or whatever. They're just, it's fashion, it's not culture. It's weird.
Any more questions?
If Klaxons were to do 10 successive nights at Wembley Stadium, would you be into dynamic pricing?
That's such a great, thanks so much. I'm gonna have to confess that I don't fully understand what dynamic pricing is. Is it that it was advertised as one price and the band failed to recognise that it was worth something? Now it's worth something else. What can someone please explain?
It just as demand goes up, the price goes up.
Yeah.
Right. So
so what should they have done?
Ed Sheeran tries to. I mean, the thing is, I thought it was slightly disingenuous where they went out and said, we didn't realise this was going on. We just left it to the promoters to sort it out. It's like, dude, you guys are smart enough to know what's going on. And everything that I've ever read says, Ticketmaster will do pricing, but they will do the pricing based on what the artist wants to do. And the artist wants to maximize. It's really hard. It's really hard because, there are, you either leave the touts to set the true market value, in which case you're not seeing, there's millions of pounds of value going into their pocket that the artist never sees. That's got to be wrong, right? The only other way round it is you do what Prince did historically, and some artists do, which is you book out 6-10 nights at a venue where you basically create such an oversupply in the market that it's worthless touts doing it. Nobody's got an answer to any of this, but I surely it's not beyond the wit of human beings to be able to kind of go in and just kind of set a standard price.
How would you have handled it? They say the format of NME was like it was back in the day. Would you have hammered Oasis for it in NME?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, without a doubt. Because sorry to sound Machiavellian, but whether you like it or not, it's a big story and it's what everyone's talking about. And that's all that mattered. It's like, what's everybody talking about? And if they're not talking about something, invent something, right? And make it an issue. It's like you were talking about stuff not being, stuff not being recorded. Yeah. Precious moment. I don't know if anybody remembers, but, back in the day, Franz Ferdinand did a gig in Leeds and it got cancelled or something, and then they decided to do a guerrilla gig outside the venue, and they jumped on top of a car, and we managed to get a photo of it, but there was no video footage of it. There was only our photo, and that was it. It was this precious moment. You were either there or you weren't there, right? These are precious commodities. You kind of invent these moments in time. But something like that, yeah, I instantly, I'm kind of like, yeah, double page spread. You do the news story on the left-hand side, relating what's happened, and then you do a kind of a for and against on the right-hand side. You get an industry analysis box, and that would be your spread. That's 2 pages of news done, right? Move on, what's next?
Can you get Klaxons 10 gigs at Wembley Stadium?
You can book them.
They may not come.
Exactly. Can you sell the tickets?
Are either of you two going to Oasis?
I'd really love to go. I didn't get a ticket, but I'd really love to go.
Did you try?
No, I didn't. I arrogantly thought, like the rest of my friends, that something will turn up and we'll figure it out.
But you know enough people that at some point, yeah, I had a little bit of a thought about that, yeah. But I didn't know. I haven't planned to get tickets. I don't know. I've seen Oasis a good few times, and sometimes it's been brilliant, and sometimes it's been fucking awful. And I'm like, I don't need to go back and do that. Fontaine's DC at Finsbury Park, supported by Kneecap. Fucking get me there. Absolutely. That's going to be an amazing gig.
It's not going to be as good as Slide Away at Wembley, mate.
Any more questions?
I've sort of got a question for each of you. I don't really know where to start this, but Conor, you've sort of answered my question already, so I'm going to start with Jamie, if that's all right. Klaxons was bred out of a big New Cross scene that I'm from the Isle of Wight. I didn't really recognise that when I was a teenager. Do you think Klaxons would be a different band had you not been from, I was going to say London, but like an inner city anywhere whatsoever?
I like that question. I think essentially no, because I don't think that Klaxons would have existed if I hadn't have had my life experiences before I made the band with my friends. I grew up not very far away from you. I can see the Isle of Wight from where my family are. And yeah, it's all right. There's no escalators on that. It's weird. But because I grew up like loving guitar music and rave culture, there was like a rave in Bournemouth that I saw that I couldn't go to because I was too young. Like Klaxons was essentially from my angle the expression of the things that I wanted to do that I couldn't do when I was younger, right? Which is what I think makes sense for the Dare right now, right? It's like the guy was 6 when the LCD sound system formed, but like it was essentially an expression of my life experience. And then I met the other guys in Nottingham, and there was a scene in Nottingham, and the scene definitely helped with the idea of like, oh, there are people to play to, and yeah, I've got friends who work in the media already, and like, yeah, there are club nights to go to and the rest of it. But would the band have existed? The band didn't exist because of the scene. Like the band existed because of the idea. Our band was an idea before it was a band. It was a conversation between me and the guitar player. We were like, should we form a band that is like this? yeah, sounds good. And that's what we did. We just saw out our plan. We planned it and then we made it. It wasn't a result of what was going on around us. And I think that's a really good way to do things. I encourage young people to do that. It's like, what is this? What do you want to do? Like, if you make something that exists, you can bring people to it. Come up with the idea before the music, and then we have the idea, and then we put the music to the idea. So I think it was a magical combination of all the different things happening at the same time. But the band was an idea, and I think ideas are a good place to start.
I just want to back that. I think that's such a powerful thing, that notion of the idea before the music, because it's the same thing with the KLF and it's the same thing with the Sex Pistols. It's like you can make up all of that stuff, right? You can earn your chops, playing a load of gigs. You might end up being great. You might end up not being great. Could Sid Vicious ever actually play the bass? Not really. Didn't matter. It didn't matter because there was something that could cut through. It's like there are loads of people who are virtuoso musicians. Anybody can take 4 chords and, kind of build a song. But somebody who's got an idea that is a precious piece of cultural commodity that will challenge and excite, that's precious. The music comes after.
100%. And I think with the idea of New Rave, it was literally what's going on right now. Okay, there's a gap in this. What is the gap in this? The gap in this is there is not a UK version that's going to sum this thing up and make this strictly UK and own this. And so I was just looking at what was going on around and then just found the gap in it and just made it exist, And I think there's really something to be said for it, Have a culturally, just look around, like, what doesn't exist? Cool. That doesn't exist, but that would be fun. Like, go for it. Do that,
Yeah, speaking of terms, I think we've got this far without mentioning indie landfill. Just quite a surprise.
Did you come up with that phrase?
No, I didn't come up with that phrase. Well, I couldn't, could I? Right? I was living off it. But no, it started to be a thing even before I left.
But you said it was largely accurate, that tag. Would you stick with that?
Yeah, well, only that, it's supply and demand, isn't it? I don't want to sound like that wanker, but, as I said before, the reality was the record labels were just record labels sign Me Too acts. That's what they do, right? So, if you get a big, kind of a male singer-songwriter like Ed Sheeran who cuts through, within the space of 3 months, 6 months, a year, you're suddenly drowning in the fuckers, right? They're all over the place, right? And, some of them are good and some of them aren't good. And it's really hard. And the same thing happened with bands during that period. And some people were able to make a career out of it and some people weren't. But you did get this kind of undifferentiated mush. And it's one of the reasons why the Arctic Monkeys were so exciting, because they turned up with no reference to anybody, didn't care, weren't wearing skinny jeans and winkle pickers, and weren't, had no interest actually in indie music at all. They were far more interested in hip hop and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And that's why they sounded fantastic. But, it was an inevitable part of the fact that, we both talked about the fact that, we kind of came from clubs and DJing and for me, curating the NME was curating a dance floor. It's like a national dance floor. And, how do you get the right sort of acts and you pace it in the right way that you fill that dance floor, from the first minute to the last minute. And part of that was about making it as accessible as possible. And so, you could feel part of the scene if you just formed a band and went down Topshop and bought the right clothes. And, suddenly you could put on a gig with your friends and you feel like you're down the Water Rats or, the Dublin Castle or, whatever else is going on. And so there wasn't that big difference between big bands in London and, everything else. It's like everybody could be part of it. And I loved that. It's part of the reason why we put Club NME into, everywhere that we could across the country. It was the democratization. But the inevitability was you just got this kind of spectrum between big bands that lots of people cared about and, kind of tiny things that were happening all over the country. And then this mush in the middle, which, nobody really knew what to do with. And eventually it just kind of fell over itself.
Anyone want to defend the pigeon detectives while we're here?
Those poor guys, they get a lot of hassle, don't
From
they?
you mainly.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, there was that scandal very early on where, you know, they played a club in somewhere in the north, and as part of it, you know, some woman had been encouraged to come on stage, and they'd thrown water over her, and it had you know, all the signals were like a wet t-shirt competition, and everyone just quite rightly went, "Whoa, no, this is absolute." And I remember the woman who was doing PR for the band at the time had a terrible job of kind of going, they weren't in charge of it. It wasn't them. It just kind of happened on stage. But there was this real sense of like, actually, who are these guys and where do they come from? And you know, the NME sometimes wore its values on its sleeve and sometimes it didn't. But that was one of those moments where everybody there was this kind of collective from the scene and from the people on the mag, this kind of collective intake of breath, like, is this a good idea? And I don't think they ever kind of really recovered from that.
It's been interesting this week, actually talking to Steph, who I been doing a deep dive on the NME Awards, and she mentioned you guys, Jamie, because we were looking at a video of the 2007 awards, and she said you guys were the only kind of influence of a feminine energy. She said it was very laddie. Is that something you were aware of at the time? Breaking it up a bit?
Well, I think I was talking to Conor about how, like, when we did the tour, it was New Am Pony Club, CSS, Crystal Castles. You know, it was completely mixed bag.
Sunshine Underground.
Yes, I think they were all lads, but yeah, it was completely like mixed bag. You know, and yeah, of course, and we were just up for wearing city clothes and having fun, and we were mostly surrounded. It was just us and girls on tour all the time, and it was fun. You know, wasn't aware of it, but I think. No, it absolutely didn't cross my mind. But I think, I don't know, we didn't want to have anything to do with social realism at the time, and that was what was going on. We were like creating a fantastical world of our own, and that was a party that everyone was invited to, and it wasn't about exclusion of any sort whatsoever. It was just like, and then it felt like it was a party every night, and everyone was there, you know. So I wasn't aware of there being any division of any sort, you know.
Which I think is very easy to say. But actually it was quite revolutionary, and it comes from the fact that your attitudes were kind of born out of UK club culture, right? And not UK band culture, right? Two really, really different things. And I was lucky enough, you know, I grew up listening to Nirvana and you know, before that the Stone Roses, and then went through the Brit pop thing. But actually when I first got into magazines, I ended up, as I said, on Dance Music magazine. So I really understood that culture. I was there for the whole kind of Crasher Kids in kind of Sheffield and Cream, and, you know, kind of Passion in Colville and all that stuff. And, you know, that sense of a democratized scene, which was, you know, which didn't care, right? Didn't care if you were gay, if you were straight, if you were black, if you were white, if you were male, you were female. You know, once everyone had taken a pill, right? You know, everybody was on the same vibe, right? And that was an anathema to this kind of very male-centric band culture. And you guys, I think, you know, you didn't really overthink it at the time, but that's why there was a totally different energy. I mean, when we split, you know, and it was the highlight of the cultural power of the NME at that time, when we split the NME Awards tour into the rock tour and the rave tour. And obviously I went to both. I can't even remember who was on the rock tour now, but but you're absolutely right. The energy on that rave tour was completely different from on the rock tour, and the rock tour started to feel almost kind of like dinosaur-esque, whereas the rave tour had this thing that was far more inclusive and progressive and interesting. I mean, it is one of the things, I've talked about it before, but it's one of the things when I look back, you know, it just terrible, shocking gender imbalance across all the years that I was there. And a lot of it was kind of a cultural inheritance. And there are notable exceptions, but, you know, I would hold my hands up and say we didn't do enough to actively promote diversity in terms of what we were doing. And, you know, if you were doing the same thing now, it would be very different.
Okay, we've got any more questions? I appreciate we're all a bit older these days, so I want to get back on.
I was just going to say, it seems like there's a clear divide between the start of the noughties and the end of the noughties. Do you think that's because of Arctic Monkeys, and how did the vibe feel at NME? It probably when it became more commercial off the back of them, maybe.
I've talked about it before, but the thing that really felt that kicked off the scene, because the Strokes and the Stripes were American, and it created this massive demand for bands, and there wasn't anything in the UK that was interesting, and suddenly all of these bands got imported from all over the English speaking world. So you got the Datsuns from New Zealand and the Vines from Australia, and the Hives were suddenly kind of pulled into this whole thing, and anybody who had a guitar was suddenly kind of part of it. But the thing where it really felt like it kicked in was Franz Ferdinand. And I was so excited because I suddenly felt like, this is my band. This is going to make a massive cultural impact. And I'm the guy who's, in charge of the NME when it happened. It's like, I've got a thing. And actually, that was only part of it. Suddenly we got all of this other stuff that was going on, and, it turned into something else and brilliant. But as I've discussed before, it's like, there was a real sense that when Arctic Monkeys turned up, almost immediately they turned up. Because everything had been getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more influential. And when they turned up, it was like, nothing's going to be as big as that. That is as big as it's going to get. And everything after that is going to be downhill. And, it was like, right, after that, it's like you're just riding out the rest of the roller coaster. You've been taken up to that peak. It's gravity that's going to take you down all the way. And then for me, it was like, at what point can I jump off so I don't, end up crashing into something on this thing? But Arctic Monkeys were just amazing. You asked earlier on, what's your favourite album from that era, and favourite worst nightmare? Now, out of everything, there's a lot of stuff that I don't go back to and I can't listen to because it either hasn't stood the test of time or emotionally it's too caught up in a whole load of stuff. But that for me was absolutely, of those NME bands, that was the single best thing. And I think that energy from that band sustained everything for a good few years, but it only lasts so long, right? And then suddenly, you're kind of 2-3 years into that thing, and the question was, what's going to come after? Where are the new ideas? And I don't think anybody was really set up to answer that question at all.
I'll give it a shot. My experience was that in the early noughties, you've got the bands that broke through, all huge, all generating loads of money at major record labels. It's already happening. Everyone's making loads of money. There's loads of bands. It's all happening. By the time we signed to a major record label in 2006, it came out 2007. We were one of the last bands to sell CDs. And then by the time our second record came out, in that time between 2008 and 2010. The sound on the radio had completely changed. Like, it had gone from being bands on the radio that were on daytime radio to, by the time after our record came out, EDM had come out, dubstep had come out, and Radio 1 was playing pop music all day long. Like, there weren't bands that were like filling that gap. And I think what had happened was that streaming hadn't quite started, and that the major record labels hadn't figured out how to make money anymore. And there was a period in time where they didn't know that they just hadn't monetized the music industry for the way that it was changed, the way that it had changed. And so at that point in time, they didn't have the money to inject into other things that was happening. And electronic music was being made by one bloke on his laptop, and that doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to give a bloke £500,000 to go and make a record in France. It's like it all of a sudden the money had gone, and record labels hadn't figured out how to make money out of streaming. Forward wind a couple of years, and that's absolutely good, and it's back on, and everyone's really happy again. But that period in time, everyone was just confused, and but the industry didn't know what to do. And music changed, like EDM, dubstep. That was the end of the noughties, the beginning of the noughties. Strokes, White Stripes, end of the noughties, dubstep. It was a funny old time.
But that process that you talk about there was a reversal of what had happened previously, wasn't it? Because you'd had this dominance of grunge from the US, and then that, which is the equivalent of the Strokes, which had turned into Britpop in the UK as an answer to that, which was Franz Ferdinand and everything up to the Arctic Monkeys. And then when Britpop ran out of steam, dance music took over. Yeah, it's like Sasha and Digweed and Oakenfold and all of these male DJs, because they're always male DJs, were just kind of gods on the scene, and then and that was the dominant thing in pop culture. And then suddenly the Strokes turned up and flipped it all over again. And so that the process had just gone kind of like right the way back round.
It's probably a good finishing point unless we've got any more questions. Burning questions? All right, I think that's probably it. But can we just get a cringe selfie with the audience? Is that all right?
Yeah, let's do it.
Try and miss out those empty seats at the back.
Before we do that, can we get a huge thank you for Harry for putting this whole thing together?
Sid, thanks a lot for coming. This is kind of
a man who was single-handedly keeping the dream alive.
Yeah, if anyone wants to come on the podcast, it's running a bit low, so get in touch. All right. Yeah, but cheers for coming out. It's a bit surreal for me, so yeah, thanks a lot. And hopefully be another one down the line.